Okay. It might get a bit rambly. It's not going to be really close in either. You're not going to be able to see a lot what I'm doing because I want to be able to switch the partials and I can't do that hand holding, and that's about as close as I can get that camera. Okay, so I'm going to quickly over a couple of ways of simulating analog behaviour on here, and I'm actually going to touch on Aftertouch as well, but I'll do that in a minute. So, on old analog synths, you had two behaviours, which was instability in the synths, but it's what kind of gave them their fatness, their richness, their unique feel. The first is oscillator pitch drift. So what you'd have is one or two oscillators usually on a card, and that was one voice. But these oscillators weren't necessarily stable. DCOs were good, digitally controlled ones were quite stable, which is why they were brought in. Voltage controlled oscillators used to drift slightly. So what you get is you get a slight warbling that wouldn't be quite stable. And you can simulate this in the common tab by analog feel. And I'm going to do it, I'm going to whack it single sawtooth. That's with no analog feel. Let me turn the Unison off, I'll show, we'll go into that later. So single oscillator. Stable. If I whack analog feel all the way up, and this is way too much, you get movement. Randomly, as the pitch of that oscillator on the card drifts. Now, you would have potentially two oscillators on a card, and with two oscillators, both not quite holding steady, you'd get a fluctuating chorus effect. So if you bring the second oscillator in, I've now got two saws, and I'll demonstrate them individually without the analog feel first. So you've got partial 1, partial 2. Filters need to be on both. Okay, partial 1, partial 2. The same. If you bring analog feel in though, sorry, both together. If you bring analog feel in, you start to get each wafting separately. You can hear them both drifting separately. Not ideal, but it's what not when it's that much, but it's in small amounts when you were trying to keep them stable. That's what gave you. Okay, that's 25, which is still too much, but you can hear it. You can hear him coming into tune, out of tune, and drifting side to side. Now you want a little, you don't want enough for it to be obvious, you want enough to hear it subconsciously if you like. Now the only downside with the way Phantom uses it is when you go into the second aspect. Now the second thing you used to have when polys came along was one voice of polyphony used one card, and each card would have its two oscillators. But if you've got an 8-voice poly, you have 8 cards. Every time you pressed a key, it used the next card. So that would be card 1, voice 2, voice 3, voice 4, etc. That would be card 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1. Okay. But each card would not necessarily be in tune. You'd often find 6 would be in tune, then 7 would jump out tune slightly, and 8 would be out of tune slightly. They wouldn't drift, because that would be the oscillator drift. These are the cards being out of tune. So every time you pressed a key, whether it be in a chord or whether it be individually, each press would have maybe a slightly different pitch as it started to drift out of tune. And when you used to tune old polys, what you were doing is tightening them back up again, and then over time they drift, and you'd get this this behaviour. And you can simulate this in pitch. I did say it was in amp, I think, on the original post. It's not. It's in pitch, and it's the random depth. So what I'm going to do here is show you again. I'm going to whack it quite high, and there's 1,000 cent here, and this is the variation you can have. So we're going to bang it all the way up so you can hear it. So if I play a single note, it just holds that note. If I play the same note again, it can be all over the place. And if you're playing chords, okay, random behaviour. You don't want that. That's huge. 1,200 cents. But if you keep it low, again, I'm going to do more than ideal because I want you to still hear it. Let's go to 30 cents. can hear them drifting every time you press the key. It doesn't drift as you hold it. Flat there. 1, 2. So it's every time you press a key. So. Doesn't sound right because it's too high. That's 30 cents. By combining the two, you can get you're simulating single oscillator for polyphony synth effectively, because you've got well, it's multiple. You've got the cards are moving every time you press the note, and the oscillator can be drifting. The potential problem here is that the two oscillators within one card would drift slightly, but would be in pitch. You can't simulate this easy just using partials, because each partial, you can't have two partials gone to one random depth and keep the same random depth, if you see what I mean. A voice card would have two oscillators which might be drifting slightly, but the card would be on one pitch. You can't do it using partials. You can do it using Unison. If you were to go into, let's just take that random depth off. So if you were to go into Unison, what you can do on Unison is, if you set Unison size to 2, that's effectively using twin oscillators, so a 2 oscillator voice card, and then you can set the detune if you want to. So if you wanted a detuned oscillator sound, but on a simulating it coming from one voice card, you can do that. So here I've got 8, so I'm detuning it by 8 using 2 size Unison. So I'm getting 2 oscillators that are detuned by 8 cents. So that is simulating a twin oscillator voice card, one note. So then we're going to go back into the analog drift side, the analog drift side on the pitch. We're going to bring in that random drift, and I'm going to bring it in 8 cents. So what it's saying is every time I press a key, bearing in mind they're now Unison, so they're working as a pair, as a voice card would. Every time you press the key, you're actually getting, if I press C, I'm getting C plus or minus 8 cents randomly, only when you press the key. And if you move it up so you can hear it, we're going to keep it down at around 8 cents. We're then going to bring the oscillator drift themselves in. We're going to go back to common. We're going to bring the analog feel in, and we're only going to make that 10. So we're trying to keep it stable. The idea was, without synths, we wanted them to be in tune. They just weren't very often. So what we've got now is we've got 2 oscillators per voice card using the Unison. Those oscillators are drifting very slightly in themselves, and each voice card, again, is not necessarily in tune with each other. And what this does is give you an analog fattings type. It's not perfect because they worked in the way they work. This is trying to simulate it. But it does give you a... As opposed to, if you have the analog feel off, you went to single Unison, and where's that pitch? So if you turn them all off, you get... I'm going to put them back on. We're going to go to 10 cents just because I want to, and we're going to go to 12 analog feel. Then you get... And that's a single oscillator. Okay, in Unison sometimes to simulate 2 oscillators per card, but that is a single partial. Won't use the term oscillator in this, we'll use partial. One partial. Nice. Okay, so what I'm going to do now quickly is look at this Aftertouch. And I know some people find it hard. The 8 is particularly hard. It's a piano bed, I would expect it to be. And Roland boards do tend to be on the stiff side. The Phantom's actually very similar to the Novation Summit, same kind of weight to the Aftertouch. But I think what a lot of people are doing is they're putting the sensitivity up way too high. I think the sensitivity seems to be how quickly it transitions, not how hard you have to press it to enable it. Which is why a lot of people are seeing it going from one to, like, from all off to all on very quickly. Sensitivity is too high. So I've got my sensitivity at the moment on 64. It's halfway in the set. I think it's a bit like if it's at 0 and 1, it goes through quickly because you're having to press harder for it to engage, and then it's going quickly because you're running out of space. And if it's the other side, it's triggering slightly earlier, but it's going through the range quicker. 64 seems to be okay to trigger, and it's a slower sweep. As I've said, you're not going to be able to do massive filter swells and volume sweeps. It's not that kind of Aftertouch. It's good for bringing in subtle vibrato. You can bring in subtle a filter rise just to brighten it, or a volume rise, more volume rise just to give it some oomph. So what I've got here, I've got it set at 64. I've got it set to pitch to LFO1. I'm going to put the sensitivity on 12. You don't need much. Now, this is a jumpy board, a jumpy stand. Look, it's all over the place. If I press hard on here, the whole thing will move. But I can play that Aftertouch without it moving. Without it moving. Increased sensitivity, it goes too much. There is a bit of control there. But it's certainly usable for that kind of... Anyway, bit of an addition at the end. Hope that helped.